Well, thanks so much for coming to this. I hope you know what to expect because I don't. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm a neurobiologist, and somehow when we were talking about whether I should give a lecture here and what it should be about, we ended up with free will, and I immediately regretted it because I don't know anything about free will. And on the other hand, it seems like that hasn't prevented anybody else over the last few thousand years talking about it. And so what I really would like to do here is, instead of making a lot of pronouncements, I just want to have a discussion really, and I'm hoping that you will be active participants in this discussion. So I also have to apologize. I've been traveling across Europe for 2 weeks, and I got a terrible cold that I'm just now recovering from. So if I'm making noises that don't mean anything, then I apologize. So, okay. So I'm going to go through a number of different aspects that somehow I think relate to this issue of free will. Some of them may be fairly basic. Some of them touch on things that happen in animals or things that are ancient from an evolutionary point of view. And then hopefully we'll come around and think a little bit about how our own brains make decisions and whether they are really free and whether they really will something. Okay, so of course, I love this quote here by Singer. We must believe in free will, we have no choice. And if nothing else, if this is the message for today, I think that's already a pretty good one. Okay, so free will is this idea, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, that it's that we have some flexibility in making a choice, that there are options out there in the world, that we can make a choice, choose one of those options, and then implement it, either with an action or maybe also just an opinion about something. And so by choosing an option, we're making a decision. And so in a simple way, free will can be reduced to decision making. And so, we can go to a dictionary and look up what a decision actually is, or decision making. It's the act or process of deciding. Now that's not really surprising, but it's something that, a word that we use every day, and it's something that we do every day without thinking too much about where those decisions are actually coming from, whether they are really free decisions or whether there's something else that has preceded those decisions to cause us to do what we end up doing. And that maybe the options that we think are out there are really just an illusion. So when we look at Wikipedia, it's always good because Wikipedia at this point knows everything. We see, and this may not be entirely up to date, I copied this a while ago, decision-making can be regarded as an outcome of mental processes, such as a cognitive process, leading to the selection of a course of action among several alternatives. Every decision-making process produces a final choice. The output can be an action or an opinion of choice. So, this could also be a definition for free will, maybe. And especially if there's a cognitive process involved. Now, some of you may say, well, maybe this is something where, since we're making a choice, that we have a bunch of options and so on, that this is really what free will is. And then, as you think more about it, you realize that a machine can do this, an animal can do this. In fact, there are many machines and many animals that can make decisions, fairly complex decisions, in fact. So does that mean they also have a free will? They can do whatever they want, or does it mean that we don't have free will because animals and actually machines can also make decisions? But if we agree for the moment, we don't have to agree for the long term, but if we agree for the moment that decision making has something to do with the presence or absence of a free will, then we have to look at decision making a little bit more closely. And so how do we make decisions? Well, in an ideal world, decisions would be very easy to make because you have at least two different options, course of action that you could take, and you just would have to pick the better one, right? I mean, what else could they go wrong? You just pick the better one. And this is usually what your parents have told you, how easy it is to make decisions. But of course, in real life, we're dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty makes it difficult to figure out what the best option is quite often, if not impossible. And so there are a number of possible solutions and strategies that people have come up with when they are making decisions over thousands of years, over the course of our history. The first one would be a very rational and, if you will, philosophical way of going about it, and that is to list the advantages and disadvantages of each option. I've tried this a couple of times when I had major life decisions to make, and it didn't work really well. You could make a spreadsheet where you list the advantages and disadvantages. You can even weight them in different ways, and then you come up with a number, and at the end, you may not feel entirely satisfied because there's clearly something else that goes into it. But you know that the option that looks like is the favorable option according to this kind of process is not really the one that you want for some other reason. But of course, philosophers, starting with Plato, but also Benjamin Franklin and many others, and maybe life coaches and so on, have told us for many, many years that this is the way to go. And I think it can be quite useful, but it's clearly not the only thing that is happening inside our brains when decision making occurs. Another one that works pretty well, and seems like a lot of people follow that particular strategy, is that they're basically flipping a coin. They're going with chance. And of course you can do that also for multiple options. And maybe that is not such a bad way to go sometimes, and it's certainly a strategy that is used quite a bit as well, not only in sports. The other one would be, especially if time is an issue, it would be to accept the first best option. So we see that a lot in animal behavior, for example. Animals that are foraging, that are trying to find food, animals that are trying to find a mate, they may have a certain preference for what they would like to have. The kind of food patch they would like to find should, of course, be large and of high quality, where they would like to find a high quality mate. But in reality, there are certain limitations to what they can find. They can only explore a certain amount of space. They only have a certain amount of time to do so before they get eaten or run over or something like that. And if you think about it, the same is true for us as well. Our lifetime is limited, and even our time for certain tasks is always limited. So if you go around and you sample, and then you have to make up a decision as to what your next course of action is, whether you're going to go to this restaurant or to that restaurant, or maybe to this idealized restaurant, which may or may not exist, then going with the first best option is actually a very good strategy. And we see that a lot, both in ethics, behavior, and in economics, that this is what happens quite a bit. And it's a lot more efficient, than listing all the advantages or disadvantages of real or imagined options. It's also better than flipping a coin. Now, what people also have been doing for thousands of years is, if they don't know quite what to do, they tend to then start praying. I don't know, it seems to help some people. Or they go with cards, they read their horoscope. They may catch a bird, open it up, and read from the guts. It's just amazing what people have come up with. And of course, then you also always have to look into what's behind that and who tells them to do these things and who else has a benefit, when these decisions go a certain way. So I think, there are some fascinating things in here that we can discuss more here if you're interested. And obviously there is usually a whole ideological überbau, if you will, that makes it possible to derive a decision from those kinds of activities. But it still is very commonly done, and even people who are not religious will often resort to certain kinds of superstition and so on. Again, you find it a lot in sports as well. There are in fact airlines that don't have a row 13, there are hotels that don't have a 13th floor, those kinds of things. Of course they do have a 13th floor, they just don't call it that. And there's always a 13th row, unless it's a short airplane. So it's remarkable. And then somewhat related to this, and of course this can apply to all of the above, is where you comply with an expert or a person of authority. So you have difficulty coming up with a decision, what you should be doing, and then you turn to somebody that you trust, somebody who maybe has more experience than you do, maybe knows something that you don't know about the world, and then they will tell you what to do, and then of course then raises the question whether this is still your decision or if it's somebody else's decision. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because it has attracted a lot of attention, maybe not so much recently, but over the last few decades. It's an approach that is called decision analysis, where you basically would choose the alternative with the highest utility for each alternative. And how do you go about this? This could be seen as a more advanced version of this first strategy here. In economics, decision analysis has been very prominent, at least in academics. To which extent, this has really found its way into practice varies a little bit, although there are clearly some real believers out there. And so it was introduced by a fellow called Ronald Howard and a bunch of other people. And the reason I think why it was so successful with some groups is that as decision analysis goes, it relies on graphical representation, so that makes it very intuitive and possibly also very dangerous, that you think you have control over things that you in fact don't have control over. So there are decision trees or influence diagrams. We're going to look at a couple of those. It's also, in a way, scientific in that each outcome or each factor that plays into a potential outcome has a weighted probability, so that a probability is calculated and that goes into this equation and also into this graphical representation. But of course the problem with this is that if your assumptions are not good, and if the data, the information about the world that you have is not good, then your decision tree may be beautiful, but it may just be crap, right? And so really, even though it yields beautiful graphical representations of how complex decisions should be made, it doesn't do away with the problem that the quality of the data, or the amount of information that we have available about the particular subject matter, about the decision that we are supposed to make. If we don't have good quality data, if you don't have good information, then we haven't really made any progress. And another problem that goes along with this is that it ignores intuition. As it turns out, intuition is a really powerful tool in decision making. So here would be a couple of examples, with a decision tree based on decision analysis with weighted probabilities, where your company is in dire straits, you hire a consultant, which is the first mistake, I guess, and then there are a bunch of decisions that the consultant comes up with in his or her report, and where you may end up manufacturing a particular product or a different product, or you're not going to manufacture a product at all. And there are different kinds of weightings that go into this and that tell you what the outcomes will be. mean, this is what maybe executives usually makes feel pretty good about themselves when they can come up with that. But as you all know, especially if you know something about the business world, more often than not, these things don't work out this way. And it's simply because ultimately, the numbers, these numbers here, they give us this sense of control over the world. Often are very poorly justified. There are often assumptions that go into those numbers that are just not right. Here's a spectacular example of a spectacular failure, and this is from the Iraq War. So I'm not an American citizen, I can talk about this. They don't have to take my citizenship away if they want to report it. So anyways, so here, the military uses these decision trees a lot, and I've been told, I don't know, from my own experience. And so they had a clearly, well-articulated plan going into Iraq in how they would take out Saddam Hussein and how they would find all these weapons of mass destruction. It was laid out, and it just had to be executed. And it worked really well for the first 2 days, right? So, but there were so many things they didn't take into account. They didn't take into account the possibilities that there were no weapons of mass destruction. That just wasn't possible. They didn't take into account that maybe there would be sectarian factions and that there would be influences from outside, whether it was Al-Qaeda or whether it was Iran or other entities that would influence what was happening on the ground. And they were totally caught off guard when they thought major combat action was concluded after, I don't remember, 30 days or so, and 10 years later they were still stuck there. So clearly, a lot of smart people probably had thought about it. There was a lot of ideology that went into it. There was a lot of politics that went into it. A lot of lobbying from various sides that went into it. You came up with something like that, and it was a total failure then on the ground. Anyways, whenever people tell you about good ways of making decisions, whether they are life coaches or consultants or something like that, I think the one thing I've learned is I just run as fast as I can because I don't believe in any of it. So other approaches that people have come up with, are kind of Markov chains where you basically also have, you can represent this in a diagrammatic fashion, where you have kind of conditional transition probabilities. If one thing happens, then another thing happens with a certain probability. And so, it suffers from similar problems from a human point of view in that intuition doesn't really play into it. And then again, if you don't have good quality data, good information about the world, you may be making the wrong decisions. And then, both in economics and in biology, game theory has really been very important in understanding how animals, including human animals, make decisions. And in one particular variety of game theory in this context are these evolutionarily stable strategies. And where the basic idea is that all animals, whether they're human or non-human animals, if they have a choice of at least two different options, then they will take into account in what their own experience has been in the past in these situations, what the other individual they're interacting with, has been doing and is likely going to do in this situation, and then they have a bunch of options, and then there is usually some sort of a payoff matrix that will tell them if I do this in this particular under these conditions, I will have this kind of benefit, and if I do that under these kinds of conditions, I will have a different kind of benefit. And statistically speaking, if we follow this kind of approach, we can maximize our benefit, and that's what we should be doing. And so there are fairly simple games that people have come up with. There are also much more complicated games. What And they certainly have been quite useful in trying to understand how individuals make decisions and why they do what they do. But they leave me as a neurobiologist a little bit frustrated, shall I say, because they don't tell us anything about what's actually going on inside our brains, right, when we make decisions. So these are models of the things that are happening, behavioral decisions that are being made, but they don't tell us how we come up with those decisions in the first place in our brains. So, okay. Now, so you're welcome to interrupt or ask any questions, so I don't have to be the only one who's doing the talking here. I mean, the whole concept of a lecture, in my mind, is somewhat outdated. It's a medieval concept where, and I don't lecture much at UT. I try to teach in a different way. Lectures this is a side note, obviously, but it might be interesting anyways. And you know this already, possibly, that in the Middle Ages, when the professor would lecture at a university, he would do so because he was the only one who had the book that he wrote, right? And so the students would sit down and write down basically what the professor was lecturing, literally reading, and then they would have a seminar later on where they would discuss the content of the book or the content of the chapter.
So, in that light, I have a question about your view of how intuition differs from the decision analysis, except that it's subconscious, something that's going on in our brain, but ultimately it's due to something that we've experienced and maybe are just not aware of.
Yeah, so, intuition, so all of this, I'm not sure I have a good answer for this, but all of these approaches that have to do with pluses and minuses or this decision analysis, they have this basic tenet that we have control over the world. That if we know enough, if we have enough information, that we can make the right decision, and then once we have it all figured out, nothing can go wrong anymore, right? Again and again, it's become clear that this just doesn't work. And intuition is something that is often not accessible to consciousness. And I'm not going to talk here about, or we can, but I'm not going to give you an answer about what consciousness is because I don't know, right? So but intuition often does rise to the level of consciousness in the form of, I'm not really comfortable with this particular decision, or I have a strong hunch that we should be going this way and not that way. We might not be able to articulate it, but it still is part of our consciousness.
Well, you might, like if you decide to flip a coin, the instant that you see disappointment that it came up one way instead of the other way, that's when you know what your intuition was, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are other ways to look at this as well, is that you may already know what you want to do and you're just waiting for the coin to tell you that it's okay to do so, right? So, or the same with prayer, or the same with your horoscope, reading your horoscope, or going to an astrologer. You may just, a good astrologer or a tarot card reader or a psychic, people who actually stay in business and do this for a long time, are not people who will tell you what's going to happen in the future, because they don't know, of course, but they will tell you what you want to hear. And they tell you in a way that makes you feel good about yourself, and that it gives you kind of the sense of control that, oh, I can do something about it here, or this is what my dad, mommy always wanted me to do anyways, or something like that. And then you go ahead and do what maybe you would have done and should have done anyways, but you actually feel really good about it because the psychic told you that this is the right way to go about it. So I think, we always, whether it's a coin flip or whether it's what an expert or a psychic tells us, or we're reading something else out in the world, I think we always have to take into account the possibility that post factum, that we're just trying to arrange the world the way we always wanted it anyways, and that we would go forward with the decision and with the action that we always subconsciously intended to do anyways. We just now have an objective or a real world reason to do it. So I just don't know that our brains are remarkably good in adjusting the world to the way we see it, even after the fact. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, right? It's amazing all the things that we remember that actually never happened, for example. Right? I mean, there's very good literature on this now. I mean, there was of course, this can also, especially in court, that can be a real problem, right? That we remember things and we're fully certain about things that never happened or never happened in that particular way. Okay. Any other? Yes.
If we accept that we live in a natural world and that we're organisms and there's no mind-body duality and that our brains are organic, full of organic processes, organic chemistry going on in there, when I reach a point where I'm making a decision at that instant, if given the position of every molecule that's physically present in my body and electrical charges and everything, given that everything remains the same, can I do anything else but the decision?
Yeah, so this is the problem of determinism. That's what you're getting at, right?
Yes.
We're going to talk about this in a little bit more. Most modern neurobiologists would say, no, really, you don't have a choice, because there is no unmoved mover. Everything is the consequence of processes, microprocesses and larger processes that have been happening for microseconds before you made the decision or for thousands of years before you made the decision. They all come together in this one instant that then leads to the action that you're actually executing, and there was really no choice whatsoever, right? I don't necessarily agree with that. There are a number of reasons, and we can discuss that later, why it would probably also be pretty bad for us as a society if we tend to embrace that point of view. But that's certainly how a lot of people think at this point.
Okay, in the academic community, the word determinism, does that mean right at that point in time, or is that like, if we know the position of a planet and its motion and the forces working on it, we can tell where it's going to be in a million years. Is it, in the academic community, is it the opinion that determinism means that history is already written into the future, that everything will happen exactly as it's supposed to happen? Or is it defined at that instant of the decision?
Well, I think the only thing we can say with any certainty about the academic community is that they don't agree with each other. I think these hard determinists, as we could call them, I think there are far and few. There are not many of those left. I think there are a lot of stochastic determinists who say, well, there's a lot of noise, stuff is happening, but then on average, certain things are more likely to happen, and it's a different form of determinism. I think what it really comes down to is whether something, only because it's determined or it follows certain kinds of rules that give rise to a deterministic system, also means that things are inevitable, and as it turns out, there's a big difference, right? Only because you move and operate within a deterministic system doesn't mean that everything that happens is in fact inevitable. But we can talk about this a little later more. But I would, and certainly I would come to chime in there. I think thinking of the world as a deterministic system is, of course, very convenient because it means you don't really have to think anymore. You don't have much control over things. Maybe you can understand how it comes about. But as it turns out, the system, if we accept that it is deterministic in the sense that it is set up by a bunch of physical and other rules, may still allow for a lot of things to happen that couldn't possibly be predicted, because not everything that because of the lack of inevitability. So I think that is the big distinction that I would make here. And I don't know if that is satisfactory at this point. There was another comment there.
I had a question. Do you think that animals have intuition?
Oh, I have no doubt about it. Of course, depends how we define intuition. But if intuition is everything that we sense about the world that maybe we cannot rationally justify, or that may often not even be accessible to our consciousness, there's no doubt that they have that. And they make decisions all the time, and they often don't have much time to make decisions, and their decisions are often life and death decisions, so they're very good at that. So again, somebody could come up with a definition of intuition that would exclude animals, but I don't know how helpful that would be.
It's also a fine line between intuition and instinct. Some animals' instinctive reaction.
Well, scientists don't use the term instinct anymore, so I was going to stay away from it, but now that you said it, we might as well talk about it. So instinct, in classical behavioral research, instinct played an important role because instinct was considered to be the genetically ingrained basis of behavior that had evolved over time, basically over millions of years. Animals do things instinctively, like defending their food or going after a potential mate or so, because that's what millions of years of natural selection and evolution have kind of bred into them. And it doesn't require any decision making in first approximation. It doesn't require any learning, for example. So that's what an instinct used to be in this kind of context. Now, of course, in everyday language we use the word still, but scientists have moved away from the term instinct, and it's kind of frowned upon because we now know that there are very few behavioral actions that are truly genetically determined. Basically, everything we do or animals do, to some extent at least, requires some sort of developmental maturation, if not learning. Of course, a lot of things also require learning, even in creatures where you may be surprised that they can even learn, like sea slugs or nematode worms. They clearly learn, and actually some of their learning is very sophisticated. So, and also because we've realized that when we begin to understand the neural wiring, the neural circuitry that governs different kinds of behavior, then behavior patterns that are learned, or maybe higher level behavior patterns, if you want to call it that, and those that are more instinctive or maybe inherited or genetically determined, in terms of their neural wiring, we may not even be able to see a distinction. Right? The brain doesn't make a distinction, so why should we? So, but the work clearly still has some value in everyday language, but for now I would probably want to stick with intuition as opposed to instinct.
On that last point you made, you're talking about that as neural connections are made, whether this was something that happened because of a genetic programming that happens in a certain way, similar kind of thing that happened because of an event that happens outside the organism, and the same type of connections would form. Is that?
Yeah, so I can make it even stronger. I could say, well, for a few thousand years, people have worried about this distinction or dichotomy between nature and nurture, and some people can still get excited about it. Scientists, modern biologists certainly have moved beyond it, and if there is a modern biologist who still writes a book about nature and nurture, he probably should be flogged in public or something. I mean, it's just a money-making device, nothing else, I think. So, pardon me? The reason being that even things that are genetically determined, for example, there's a very strong genetic basis for us having 4 limbs, 2 arms and 2 legs. There's just no question about it. We understand how that works fairly well. But it's not entirely genetically determined because there is a lot of stuff that has to happen during development that if it doesn't happen right or it doesn't happen in the right kind of development environment, then something is going to be messed up, right? So the genetic code doesn't exist in isolation. Similarly, there are strong environmental factors that are important for developing or acquiring certain kinds of traits, or for learning this or that information about the world. But if there is not a genetic and a biochemical machinery there that can implement these kinds of factors, then nothing's going to happen. So it's a give and take, or what we call an interaction, right? So all modern biologists are interactionists that will readily say that a complex phenotype, like a human, including the things that humans do, is the result of a complex interaction between genes and environment, between nature and nurture. But how exactly that interaction comes about, I think that's one of the big questions for the 21st century. And we've learned a lot. I mean, there are a lot of mechanisms that are already known about it. But this dichotomy, this distinction that people used to make is certainly no longer relevant for us. It just doesn't have any heuristic value anymore. Maybe it had at some point. So coming back to the more specific point is that, even when innate, if we want to call them that, or instinctive behaviors get implemented, the neural circuits underlying those behaviors get implemented, they, during development, they get implemented only because of a complex interaction between genetic and environmental factors. If those factors are not there, if they don't work together in the right form, then we don't get this kind of a pattern. Okay. So, let's see. So here's a different way of thinking about decision making, where maybe we are slowly getting into the brain here. And one way that people often think about it is that there are different phases when we make decisions. First, we have to get certain kinds of evidence about the outside world, and also about our own state, our condition. Are we hungry or not? Are we thirsty or not? Are we tired or not? And this is in form of some sort of sensory input, through the sensory system. That there's also plenty of sensory input from inside our bodies, and so this input accumulates over time, and gives us some sort of evidence. And then maybe somewhere else in the brain, but not necessarily, this input, which could come from a lot of different sensory modalities, could be vision, it could be our hearing, it could be stretch receptors in our stomach that tell us whether we've had food recently or not. All this information is then accumulated and integrated in some sort of a perceptual mechanism, and at the end there is a decision-making machinery which again may or may not be different from the previous 2 steps, that once a certain activity threshold is reached, the decision will be communicated to some sort of a motor center in the brain, a motor center being an accumulation of neurons that basically then tell muscles to do certain things. And then there's a motor output, which commonly we call behavior. So, and obviously this can go in either direction. It can make a certain action more likely, or it can make a certain action less likely, depending on this sensory evidence that we're accumulating and depending on this perceptual process here. So this is actually a three-step model or three-phase model that is fairly well established as far as sensory decision-making is concerned. So where we take in a certain amount of information, visual information, and that's usually what it is. It's studied in the context of visual information. And we even know of neurons, and I'm not going to show you all that, we even know of neurons that encode this accumulating evidence in terms of their firing rate. So as you probably know, neurons encode information, not all of them, but many of them, in the form of action potentials. And so they may fire more action potentials as the evidence increases, and they do this for a little while, and they pass on this information to another set of neurons that then basically do a calculation where they integrate this kind of evidence from many, many different neurons and form a percept. And we know of those neurons as well that have those kinds of properties. And then there's another set of neurons that then will basically get this percept information, and if it's above a certain threshold, then a certain action will be engaged or will be executed.
Do different sensory inputs affect different parts of the brain in terms of the percept?
Yeah, that is a good question. So most of this work has been done in the context of visual perception. But the answer almost has to be yes, because we know that the sensory processing, these first few steps of sensory processing, happen in a very dedicated fashion in different parts of the brain. So, but of course, at some point, different sensory modalities converge onto, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, onto more, if we want to call it that, higher level decision-making processes or decision-making mechanisms. And so that's when then information from, let's say, visual or auditory or some other sensory modalities come together. But from a perceptual decision-making point of view, that only requires vision or only requires hearing, you can have a percept that is unimodal, that only comes with one sensory modality, only vision, or only hearing. It depends where in the brain you're looking for it. Does that answer your question? So, okay. So and that gets us to this point. Where and how are these decisions made? And how did this decision-making system evolve? What's a little unsatisfactory about this model, which has, as I said, a lot of good real-world support in terms of visual, mostly visual perception making in certain parts of the brain, the monkey brain in particular, where most of this work has been done, is that it doesn't tell us much about more complex decisions. It doesn't even tell us much about other sensory modalities, like some other sensory decisions, sensory decisions or auditory decisions, in like turning your head in response to a sound or so. And that's just where we stand. But there is a complementary approach that has been asking, what are the neural substrates, what are the brain regions important for more complex kinds of decisions that are not just sensory decisions. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. And in order to do so, I think we have to, and I said this already earlier, we have to remind ourselves that we are humans. We consider ourselves to be a fairly unique species on this planet, but as it turns out, when you look around carefully, you realize we are not really that unique, right? We do a few things that maybe other animals don't do as much. Maybe we do things that in sum together, we don't find a lot in the animal kingdom, but with the exception of language, and maybe that can even be argued, there's really nothing left that makes us unique. Even, I can say this here with this audience, something like superstition or religiousness or believing in some higher entity, it's actually remarkable how you can get animals to do those kinds of things as well, right? Superstition in animals is very common. If you have a dog, you may have observed it yourself. It's usually a riot. It's pretty funny. So imagine somebody who's looking at us as a species and looks at our superstitions. They're probably laughing. So with language, this is something we have to be still careful about. And then also things like moral judgments, which if we have time, we can talk more about later. Although clearly morality is also something that has evolved. It didn't just come out of nowhere when the first humans appeared. But at a much more basic level, animals, including our own species, we face certain kinds of situations throughout our lives that are actually fairly similar or comparable across a very diverse range of animals. And we face challenges such as protecting our offspring from danger, competing for resources like food, defending our territory against intruders, or somebody who wants to take it, avoiding predators, or in our modern world maybe avoiding getting hit by a bus or something like that. And as it turns out, we're all very good at these things, and animals in general are also very good. And so if we look at those kinds of aggressive interactions that are often the result of a challenge of this kind, we find that the way animals display these challenge responses or aggressive behaviors is very, very diverse, right? The motor patterns are incredibly different. And if we look at these two fish here that are about to lock their mouth, or these two alligators or whatever they are, or these frogs or these two wrestlers here, or foxes, these are very, very different behavior patterns. And so it wouldn't work for a fish to fight against a human, right? Because we do it very differently. But we do it nevertheless, and we recognize those kinds of behaviors as aggressive, even though they are very different from our own. And they're always in response to some sort of challenge along these lines that I've said. So that is very much common across all animals. Similarly, it is when we face opportunities, right? So, and those opportunities, I just have a few here, could be finding a mate for reproduction, it could be finding a suitable habitat, it could be finding food. And if you will, they are kind of the other side of the coin of a challenge, right? Because often when we find an opportunity, there will be somebody else who will challenge us. And that is true in humans, and that is true in animals as well. And again, there are different kinds of displays that animals show when they encounter an opportunity to attract a female or to find a food source, but they all have these kinds responses. So why am I telling you that? It's for one reason because even though you may watch a lot of Discovery Channel or Nature Channel and look at these nature shows and be fascinated by all the different things that animals do, I think it makes sense to think this through and realize that whether it is a nematode worm or whether it is a chimpanzee, the kinds of challenges and opportunities we face are actually quite comparable. How we respond to them in terms of the motor patterns that we show is very different, obviously, because we have very different body plans, we move in different kinds of media, and so on. And the other reason why I'm telling you that is that the underlying, at least for vertebrates, so we're going to limit our discussion here to vertebrates, that the underlying neural machinery that allows animals to make decisions in response to a challenge or in response to an opportunity is actually remarkably similar across all vertebrates, including ourselves. And so that's when we come to the neurobiology of decision making, which hopefully then we can get to the elevate to this level of free will. So there are two circuits, neural circuits that we know about that are important for these kinds of decisions that you and I and every vertebrate animal on this planet engages every day. One is the so-called dopaminergic reward system that is shown here in this kind of typical, in a lateral view, a side view of a typical mammalian brain. And I'm not going to go what these different brain regions are, other than tell you that this is all well established. It's a system that is called a reward system because it has long been shown to encode the rewarding properties of a stimulus. If you could also say the salience of a stimulus, has it positive valence or negative valence. And it's called dopaminergic because the neurotransmitter biogenic amine dopamine plays a fundamental role in modulating this system. This system is the system that gets hijacked when you get addicted to drugs. This is the system that gets hijacked when you fall in love. And when you have heartache, it feels just like withdrawing from drug because neurobiologically that's exactly the same thing. And so the other system is the so-called social behavior network, a somewhat unfortunate term, which is further back in the brain, but as you can see, or maybe you can't see it if you're further back, there are two brain regions that are actually overlapping here. As it turns out, all these brain regions are highly interconnected. It's just that for historical reasons, these two systems have been studied mostly in isolation by different groups of researchers, although that has been changing over the last couple of years. And so what we decided to do is that we merged the two, and we call it a social decision-making network because it sounds really good. Well, it was largely a salesman argument. I mean, as a scientist, you also have to sell your product, right? So I'm not going to lie about this. But anyway, so that's kind of the stylized version of this particular set of brain regions. And in first approximation, this is the network or circuitry that basically evaluates sensory information that comes in that has already been pre-processed in sensory areas, that assigns positive or negative stimulus valence to that information, valence to this information, and then takes into account the condition of the animal as well as some sort of a history in the form of memory to then make a decision about what the best course of action should be. What you notice here is that this whole area here has been excluded from this analysis, and this is the cortex, the cerebral cortex, right? Especially up here, the so-called prefrontal cortex, which you may have heard of as being kind of the seat of our working memory, which is a modern-day synonymous with free will, if you will. And there is a reason for why I'm excluding this. Because right now we're looking at the evolution of the system, and the evolutionary antecedents of the cortex, the cerebral cortex outside of mammals, is very, very contentious. It's not clear. Even though I know what those antecedents are, others don't agree with that. Whatever they say, I don't agree with that. So it's just not clear, even though there has been some really good progress just in the last few years on figuring this out. So we'll probably not talk too much about the prefrontal cortex, except for one experiment that I'll show you in a moment. But suffice it to say that basically all these complex decisions that we find in mammals, that mammals are able to do, non-mammalian vertebrates can do just as well, and they don't have that kind of cortical structure. So that is another justification why we can ignore it for now. But I'm not saying it's not important, okay? So when we look at gene expression now, and we're just looking at 10 genes here, the activity of 10 genes, I'm not going to justify how we came up with those genes. Throughout this social decision-making network, we looked at 88 different species across vertebrates. We find that overall, there's a huge amount of conservation that is illustrated in this heat map here, where each row is basically one gene in one brain region. There are 120 rows here, and the orange means that this gene is in fact active there, and purple means that it's not active there. And there's another way to represent this, and I don't know where this fingerprint comes from. And what this basically means, again, I'm not going to go into all the details, is that there's a lot of red suggesting that over 450 million years of evolution, that is, when the fish that we find in Shoal Creek and us had the last common ancestor, not much has really changed in this particular system. Okay, so this is really ancient, has been there for a long time. And that some of the basic mechanisms of how these animals make decisions are not that different from how we make decisions. Okay, so, all right. So given all that, I think what we want to keep in mind is that the decision-making structures that we have in our brain are not unique to humans, right? They are ancient, they are very old, and they have to be, because if we agree that there's an evolutionary history to humans and to all life on this planet, that things have evolved, then it's very unlikely that they come out of nowhere. Evolutionary novelty is almost an impossibility, right? There are novel things, but they're usually built from structures that already existed in some way. The other thing that we have to now agree on, if we have this basic agreement, is that there is variability in decision making, right? Not only across individuals, across species, but also across individuals, because, and we'll look at a few examples in a moment, and that gives rise, of course, to interesting questions as well. If there is such a thing as free will, if there is such a thing as independent decision making that is independent of things that have occurred right before, then it also means that there is variability across individuals, how much free will they have or how much independent decision making they have. If you really think about it, then obviously that seems fairly trivial. People differ in the amount of impulsivity, some have more self-discipline, some have less self-discipline. But what that means, once we make that agreement, it also means that we are not actually created equal, right? We're clearly not, and what are the implications for that? So what is free will? Well, here's another definition that I'm sure everybody can disagree with. It's the ability to consciously decide how to act. Okay, I couldn't come up with anything more general and less offensive. But I'm sure somebody can be offended by that. So, and then there are many other ways that we can talk about it. And you see, I'm really reluctant to do that because people are always given to pronouncements about, this and that, and this is how the world works. And I think I've been around too many bad places that I've decided at some point this is just not worth doing it. We've talked about this already a little bit before. So what is this about now, whether there's a free will or not, right? So what I've told you so far kind of went into this direction that there is this evolved structure that is important for making decisions, that a lot of our experience, genetic information, learned information goes into decision-making processes. Maybe everything is pretty much predetermined, meaning each state of affairs causes the succeeding state. And if we believe that to be true, then the question is raised, well, is there such a free will? And if we then conclude that there is no such thing as a free will, then we are hard determinists. And that's just a little frustrating, right? It basically means we're just reflex machines, and that's just not how we like to look at ourselves. We can also say, well, there is determinism, but there's still a free will, and so the two things are actually not incompatible. They're compatible with each other. And that's the idea of what I told you earlier, is that even though the world may be a deterministic system, that doesn't mean that everything that happens is inevitable, that there is actually control that we have simply because of the rules that a deterministic system follows. And of course, we could also go to the other extreme of hard determinism. We could say nothing is predetermined, there is no such thing as determinism, and they would be referred to as libertarianism. And libertarians and hard determinists, they don't get along with each other. They are considered to be incompatible. And so this is philosophical libertarianism. The political libertarianism that we sometimes see is only usually poorly informed by that. So I'm not talking about political libertarianism necessarily. So that's where kind of the discussion stands. And now let's look at a little bit of neurobiology that first came to the fore in the early 1960s here. And so those were two German neurobiologists, Kornhuber and Deke, who published this paper. They published an earlier one, but that's where this figure comes from in 1964, where they basically put electrodes on the head of people and they asked them to make a decision, such as, say, remember, when they thought about a particular event, and that's when the clock was stopped. But at the same time, these electrodes were recording brain activity through the skull, and what they showed was that about half a second before the conscious decision was made, before the subject made a conscious decision, there was already a potential change, so indicating that there was already activity in the brain that preceded the conscious awareness of that decision. As if that decision was already ongoing in the brain before it became consciously aware to the subject. And then some years later, I think first in 1970, a physiologist at UCSF, Benjamin Libet, then kind of perfected that experiment. And what Libet did is he had this thing, this point here running around this clock here all the time, and then when the subject made a movement, just like moving the wrist or so, that indicated that they had made a conscious decision to stop that clock. So then the clock would just stop. And there are a number of different versions of that experiment, that is one. But again, he had the subjects equipped with electroencephalogram electrodes, EEG electrodes, so they could record brain activity. And again, he found that about half a second before the wrist flick or before the conscious decision was made by the subject, there was already a rise in activity in particular brain regions anticipating this conscious decision. And so for the determinists, that was a great day, because that basically suggested, that's one interpretation, that even if we make a conscious decision about something like that, about when to stop a clock, for example, there's already activity in our brain, and there are other studies later on that show that some of that activity already occurs many seconds, not only half a second, but many seconds before the decision becomes conscious in our mind, that the activity in the brain is already there, suggesting really there is no such thing as a conscious volitional action, as he called it here.